They called her a monster, not because she howled at the moon, not because she bore fangs or claws, but because she dared to survive. She was dragged from her burning home, dirt on her face, tears cutting through the ash, while the Alpha stood in his crown and his silver armor and pointed at her like she was nothing, like she was less than nothing. Her son watched it all. A small, quiet boy with dark hair and eyes that never quite looked human. They thought she was broken. They thought she was finished. But here's what they didn't know. That little boy, he hadn't shifted yet. And the night he finally did, the ground shook. Because the mark that burned gold on his chest, it wasn't the mark of a rogue. It wasn't the mark of a monster's child. It was the seal of the Ashen Crown, the lost bloodline. The one every alpha in the known packs had spent 20 years trying to bury. Stay with me. Because this story doesn't start with a crown. It starts with fire. Chapter 1. There is a particular kind of cold that has nothing to do with snow. It lives in the space between people, in the way a crowd parts when you walk through it, in the way eyes slide away from yours, not because they don't see you, but because they've decided long ago that you aren't worth the trouble of truly looking at. Mara knew that cold better than she knew her own heartbeat. The Iron Veil pack stretched across the northern highlands like a scar on the earth, ancient, vast, and unapologetic. Its territory ran from the frost-bitten peaks of the Ashridge Mountains down into the dense, black pine forests of the lowlands, where the snow fell 6 months out of 12 and the wind had a voice that sounded, on the worst nights, almost like a warning. It was powerful. Everyone knew it. Everyone felt it. That particular hum of collective strength that radiated from a pack with deep roots and deeper pride. Iron Veil wolves carried themselves differently, stood taller, spoke less. When they entered a room, other wolves noticed, and at the center of all that power, at the absolute apex of Iron Veil's brutal, blood-forged hierarchy, stood Alpha Calum. He was the kind of man that stories were built around, whether he wanted them to be or not. Silver-haired despite his years, with pale blue eyes that held the temperature of a frozen lake in mid-January. He wore his crown not like a decoration, but like an extension of his spine, as though removing it might cause him to fold. His armor was dark and precise. His voice, when he used it, landed like a door closing in a quiet room. He did not rule with cruelty, exactly. He ruled with certainty, which, in many ways, was worse. Because certainty leaves no room for questions. And in Iron Veil, questions were the first thing the hierarchy crushed. The pack organized itself in layers. At the top, the Alpha and his inner circle, warriors, bloodline elders, ranked wolves who had earned their proximity to power through lineage or battle or both. Below them, the working wolves, the hunters, the builders, the healers. Further down still, the unmated, the young, the recently arrived. And at the very bottom, at the outermost edge of the outermost rim, on where the pack's territory thinned into scrubland, and the nearest neighbor was a half-mile of frozen silence, lived Mara. Her home was small, honest in the way that things built by a single pair of hands tend to be. Timber walls, a stone hearth, a roof that held against most storms and surrendered occasionally to the worst ones. She had patched it herself 3 times over. There was a garden that produced more stubbornness than vegetables, and a single window facing east, because she had decided early on that if she was going to be at the edge of everything, she would at least wake up to the light. She was not old, but she carried herself like a woman who had weathered enough to add years to her face that time alone hadn't put there. Dark hair, usually pinned back and escaping anyway. Amber eyes, warm in color, careful in expression. Freckles scattered across the bridge of her nose and down her cheekbones like ink flicked from a brush. There was a quality to her stillness that some people mistook for submission. Those people had never seen her hunt. She was, by every formal measure, a member of the Iron Veil pack. She attended the seasonal gatherings. She paid her territory tithe. She followed the laws. But she was not welcomed. There is a difference, and Mara had long since stopped pretending otherwise. It had started with her mate's death. Davin, ranked, respected, the kind of wolf other wolves followed without being asked. had died 3 years ago under circumstances the Pack Council had classified as a border incident and quietly refused to elaborate on. One investigation, no findings, case closed. And somehow, in the silence that followed, the suspicion that should have pointed outward had turned inward, toward the woman he'd left behind. Grief has a way of needing somewhere to land. The Pack had landed it on Mara. She must have driven him to it. Whispered at the well. Something was always off about her. Said behind hands at the market. Did you notice how her boy never plays with the other children? Breathed between ranked wolves at the fire gatherings just loudly enough to be heard. She heard it all. She was a wolf. Of course she did. She said nothing. She went home. She made dinner. Eli was 6 years old and had never once behaved like a 6-year-old. He was not difficult. He was not loud or destructive or demanding in the ordinary ways of small children. He was simply still. Watchful in a way that made adults shift their weight and find reasons to look elsewhere. He had his mother's dark hair and, technically, his mother's amber eyes. But there was something in them that went beyond color. Something that lived behind the amber. Something that caught the firelight on certain evenings and held it a breath too long before releasing it. The other Pack children felt it, even if they couldn't name it. They didn't taunt him, exactly. They simply arranged themselves, instinctively and without discussion, so that there was always a little more space around him than around anyone else. Eli never seemed to mind. He spent most of his time watching things. The way snow fell, the way fire moved, the way his mother's hands worked when she thought he wasn't paying attention. He watched her more than anything else, and every night, without exception, and after the fire was banked and the cold pressed against the walls and the distant sounds of the Pack's heart carried faintly on the wind, Mara would pull him close, her chin resting on the top of his head, and she would say the same thing she always said. You are not what they say you are. She said it like a prayer, like armor, like the only wall she had left to put between her son and a world that had already decided, without evidence and without mercy, exactly what kind of creature he was going to be. What she didn't say, what she couldn't say, because she hadn't yet found the words, and perhaps because some part of her already sensed that the words, once spoken, could not be taken back, was the rest of it. I don't know what you are, but I know it's something I've never seen before, and I know they'll come for it, or when they find out. So until then, until I understand, I will keep you at the edge of everything, where the cold lives, where no one looks, where you are safe. Outside, the snow fell on Iron Vale. The Pack slept in their warm, ranked homes, arranged in their careful hierarchy, dreaming their certain dreams. And at the edge of it all, a mother held her son a little tighter and waited for a morning she did not yet know was coming. Chapter 2. It began, as most injustices do, with a body and a crowd that had already decided who was responsible before anyone had asked a single question. His name was Fenric, 19 years old, a junior-ranked wolf, eager, well-liked, the kind of young man who laughed too loudly at pack fires and was forgiven for it, because everyone assumed he'd grow into his volume. He was found at dawn, 2 miles east of the borderlands, in a clearing where the snow had been torn up and darkened. The wounds were severe, deep, the kind that spoke of something enormous and uncontrolled. A shift gone feral, the elders said, when they crouched over him in the gray morning light. The kind of damage that didn't come from a clean fight or a border skirmish. This was rage made physical. Hunger without reason. The Pack Council convened before the body was cold. Mara heard about it the way she heard about most things in Iron Vale. Late and sideways. A woman at the market who stopped talking when Mara approached, but had been talking loudly enough a moment before. The particular silence that fell when she passed a cluster of ranked wolves near the eastern well. The way 2 young mothers gathered their children closer as Eli walked by, as if proximity to him might transfer something contagious. She went home. She told herself it was nothing. She didn't sleep. By midnight, the whispers had found her door slipping through the cracks in the timber like smoke. They're saying it was a rogue wolf, a feral, and then lower. They're saying she brought one in, that she's been feeding them at the border, that she's been one of them all along. Mara sat by her banked fire and listened to the dark and thought about all the ways a lie, repeated with enough conviction, becomes the only truth a frightened community can hold on to. She thought about Eli, asleep in the next room. She thought about Davin, 3 years in the cold ground, and how dying hadn't been enough to protect her from the shadow of his disappearance. She did not run. She considered it, honestly, practically, with the clear eyes of a woman who had long since traded illusions for instinct. But running looked like guilt, and she had done nothing wrong. She had done nothing wrong. She held on to that like a rope above a drop. They came at dawn, not a quiet knock, not a summons. A column of ranked wolves moving through the snow in formation, silver-cloaked, armor catching the pale gray light of an iron veil morning that hadn't yet decided whether it would offer sun or storm. At the front of them, Alpha Calum. Mara opened her door before they reached it. She would not be dragged out. She would stand in her own threshold, on her own ground, and she would make them say it to her face. He stopped 6 feet from her door, close enough that she could see his eyes clearly, that pale, frozen blue, holding no warmth and no doubt and no flicker of the question that should, by every reasonable measure, have been living there. The crown sat on his silver hair like it had been born there. His jaw was set. His decision was already made. She had known, looking at him, that it had been made since before he left the pack house. Mara. Her name in his mouth. Not a greeting. A verdict being read aloud. Alpha. She kept her voice steady. She was proud of that later. She was terrified, and she kept her voice steady. He didn't waste time. That was the thing she would remember most in the months ahead. Not the words, but the speed of them. The absolute absence of hesitation. As if she were a problem with an obvious solution, and he was merely the man efficient enough to apply it. Fenric is dead. The kill pattern matches a feral shift. You have had no alibi submitted, no ranked wolf to speak for your whereabouts, and a history in this pack of, I was home. She said it clearly, with my son, as I am every night, as anyone who has ever bothered to look would know. Something moved behind his eyes, not doubt, something colder than doubt, the faint recognition of a complication, quickly filed away. You are a rogue sympathizer, he continued, as if she hadn't spoken. A corrupting presence, an uncontrolled variable in a pack that cannot afford variables. A pause, the weight of a decision dressed up as a speech. You are a monster, and monsters don't belong among wolves. The words landed in her chest like a blade finding the space between ribs. Precise, devastating, almost surgical in the way they took everything ordinary about her life and reclassified it as threat. She heard Eli stir behind her. She did not turn around. You have no evidence, she said. The rope. She was holding the rope. You have no trial. You have fear dressed up as law, and you know it. Keelam held her gaze for exactly 1 second. Then he raised his hand. The fire started at the eastern wall. They were efficient about it. She would grant them that. In the bitter accounting she would do later, over and over, in the cold dark of the wilderness. It took less than 2 minutes for the flames to find the roof, less than 3 for the window, her east-facing window, her morning light, to blow outward in a breath of smoke and orange heat. Mara was pulled from the threshold by 2 ranked wolves before the doorframe caught. She fought them. She was not gentle about it. She was not dignified. She clawed and twisted and got an elbow free long enough to feel it connect with something solid before they got her fully into the snow. She hit her knees. Cold flooded through her. Ash was already finding her face, her hair, settling into the tears she hadn't given herself. Permission to shed and shedding them anyway. Mama. Eli was there. She didn't know how. She hadn't seen them take him out, hadn't seen who had carried him, couldn't reconstruct the sequence, but he was there, pressed against her side, his small body rigid and his dark eyes fixed on the burning house with an expression no 6-year-old should have been capable of producing. She wrapped both arms around him and pulled him into her chest and tucked his face against her shoulder so he couldn't see it anymore. She made herself look. Someone had to witness it. Someone had to carry the memory of exactly what was done and refuse to let it be softened by time or distance or the convenient amnesia of people who preferred not to remember their own silence. She looked at the fire consuming the walls she had patched 3 times over, the roof she had fixed in the rain, the garden, the hearth. Then she looked at the pack. They lined the path in 1s and 2s and clusters, ranked wolves, working wolves, the unmated and the young and the long-established. Every face she had nodded to at the market, every neighbor who had watched her carry timber and haul water and build a life at the edge of everything. They watched. Not one of them spoke. Not one of them stepped forward. The silence of a crowd that has decided, collectively, that the cost of conscience is too high. That silence is its own kind of violence, and Mara felt it land on her skin like the heat from the fire, like the cold from the snow, like the weight of a verdict delivered without a single question asked. Caleb turned his horse. His silver cloak caught the firelight as he rode. He did not look back. They left her there, in the snow, at the edge of the pack's territory, at the edge of everything, with her son in her arms and ash on her face and nothing else in the world. The fire finished what it had been sent to do, and the frozen wilderness opened ahead of her like the only door left. She stood up. She held Eli tighter, and she walked into it. Chapter 3. Survival doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with clarity or courage or any of the clean emotions that stories like to assign it. It arrives in the grinding, unglamorous present tense. The next step, the next breath, the next decision made, not because you're brave, but because stopping is the only alternative, and stopping means your child dies in the snow beside you. Mara didn't survive the wilderness because she was extraordinary. She survived it because she refused, hour by hour, and then day by day, to do anything else. The first night was the worst. Not because of the cold, though the cold was a living thing, pressing through her clothes and into the meat of her shoulders and the bones of her hands with a patience that felt almost personal. Not because of the dark, though the dark beyond pack territory was a different quality of darkness entirely, deeper and older, and stripped of the distant hearth glow that even the outermost rim of Ironvale had always provided. The first night was the worst because Eli didn't cry. He should have cried. He was 6 years old, and he had been carried out of his burning home and marched into a frozen forest by a mother who was barely holding her own body upright. He should have been inconsolable. He should have asked for things she couldn't give him: warmth, food, his bed, the stuffed wolf he'd left on the floor beside it. Instead, he walked beside her in silence, one hand wrapped around 2 of her fingers, and watched the dark between the trees with those careful amber eyes. That silence frightened her more than tears would have. She found the ruins on the 3rd day. She almost walked past them. They were swallowed so thoroughly by the forest, by decades of ivy and snowfall and the patient reclamation of old stone by older roots, that they barely registered as man-made until she was nearly on top of them. A collapsed outer wall, the ghost of a foundation. At the center, miraculously, a structure that still held 3 walls and most of a roof, enough to break the wind, enough to hold heat if she could make a fire. She learned later, in fragments, what the place had once been. A border outpost built in an era before Ironvale's current borders existed, before any current pack's borders existed. Territory that no living alpha had ever claimed, that the old maps marked only with a symbol the younger wolves couldn't read and the older ones refused to explain. Land soaked in the old magic, the kind that predated pack law and wolf hierarchy, and every system of dominance and submission that had been built on top of it, like successive floors of a house whose foundation no one had bothered to inspect. Mara didn't know any of that yet. She knew it was shelter. She knew she could work with shelter. She went to work. Within a week, she had a fire that stayed lit. Within 2, she had walls that kept out the worst of the wind, patched with pine boughs and packed snow, and a stubbornness that would have impressed anyone watching, and no one was watching, which suited her perfectly. She hunted with her bare hands and her wolf instincts and a sharpened stake she'd made from a fallen branch, because everything she'd owned that had been worth owning had burned. She bled regularly. her palms from the work, her feet from the terrain, once badly from a hunt that went sideways in the dark, a gash along her forearm that she cleaned with snow and bound with a strip torn from the hem of her shirt, and said nothing about to Eli, who was watching her from the doorway with that expression she was already learning to dread, the one that was too old for his face, the one that understood too much. She ate what she caught. She gave Eli the larger portion and told him it was because she wasn't hungry, and he was 6 and believed her, which was the one mercy the wilderness extended. She did not cry again. She'd spent those tears in the snow outside the burning house, and she had decided, somewhere between the 2nd and 3rd day, that she couldn't afford more. Grief was a weight, and she was already carrying everything she had. Well, she would process it later, she told herself. Later never quite arrived. But Eli was changing. It was subtle at first. The kind of thing a less attentive mother might have filed under exhaustion or trauma, or the simple strangeness of a child adjusting to upheaval. He slept poorly, not restlessly, not with nightmares, but lightly, as if some part of him was always partially awake, monitoring something Mara's senses couldn't detect. He was drawn to the oldest section of the ruins, the collapsed portion, the part she'd mentally classified as unusable and blocked off with a rough timber barrier, pulled at him the way fire pulls at moths. She found him standing at the barrier 3 nights running, not trying to climb it, not reaching for anything, simply standing, facing the stones, still as water in a sealed container. She moved the barrier further from his sleeping area. He found it in the dark anyway. Eli? She'd taken him by the shoulders the 4th time, crouching to his level, in the blue dark of a moonlit night, the ruins silent around them. What are you doing? He'd looked at her with those amber eyes, faintly luminous in the low light, and said with the devastating directness of a child who hadn't yet learned to soften things, "It's calling me." "What is?" He considered this with a seriousness that sat wrong on his small face. "I don't know its name yet." She moved them back inside. She put more wood on the fire. She told herself it was the trauma, the displacement. Children process things in unusual ways. But 2 nights later, sitting beside her at the fire while she worked a piece of timber into something useful, he asked her the first question she couldn't answer. "Mama, why does the cold feel alive?" She paused, set down her work. "What do you mean, baby?" "When it touches me." He frowned at his own hands, turning them over in the firelight as if consulting them. "It feels like it's paying attention, like it knows I'm here and it wants me to know it knows." A pause. "Does it feel like that to you?" The fire crackled between them. "No," she said carefully. "It doesn't." He nodded, unsurprised, as if this confirmed something he'd already suspected. Then, "Why did the other children always smell afraid of me, even when I didn't do anything?" The question hung in the warm air of the ruined shelter like smoke. Mara looked at her son's face, soft-cheeked, dark-haired, like carrying something ancient behind eyes that should have been worrying about nothing more significant than play and food and sleep, and she felt the familiar shape of an answer she didn't have, pressing against the inside of her chest. "Because people are afraid of things they don't understand," she said. It was true. It was also insufficient. They both knew it. Eli looked at the fire for a long moment. "Am I something they don't understand?" She pulled him close, pressed her lips to the top of his head, held him with both arms and both hands and everything she had. "You are something remarkable," she said into his hair, "and the world isn't ready for remarkable. It never is." She didn't know. That night, that 70 miles away in the Iron Vale pack house, a second body had been found. Same borderlands, same brutal pattern. Same wounds that spoke of something feral and enormous, and entirely unconnected to any woman surviving alone in the wilderness with her small son. She didn't know that the ranked wolves who found it had gone quiet in a way that was different from the first time, not the busy, purposeful quiet of a community channeling its fear into action, but the hollow, terrible quiet of people beginning to understand that they may have acted in terrible haste. She didn't know that Alpha Calum had stood in the snow above the second body at dawn and been completely, uncharacteristically still, that his beta had said something something justifying, something explaining, and that Calum had not responded. That he had looked at the kill pattern and thought, with a precision that his pride could not yet convert into words or action, or anything as costly as an admission, I sent her into the wilderness for this, and this is still happening, which means he had stopped the thought there, sealed it behind the same wall that had built his crown and his authority, and every decision he had never once reversed in a decade of rule. He turned away from the body. He walked back to the pack house. He said nothing. Pride is a chain, and Calum wore his without feeling its weight, for now. Chapter 4. There are moments that divide a life cleanly in two, before and after. Not the loud moments, not the fires or the verdicts or the things that announce themselves with noise and witness, and the full terrible theater of public cruelty. Those are the moments you see coming, even if you cannot stop them. The dividing moments are quieter than that. They happen in small rooms, in the dark, when you are alone with the truth and the truth has finally run out of patience. Mara's happened on the 14th night in the ruins, during the worst storm the northern wilderness had offered since her arrival. And it happened because her sun fell down. The storm had been building since midday. She'd felt it in the pressure behind her eyes, in the way the pines beyond the ruin walls had gone preternaturally still in the hours before the wind arrived, that held breath silence that the wilderness used as its only warning. She'd brought in extra wood, banked the fire higher, reinforced the bough and snow patchwork on the north-facing wall until her hands were raw and her shoulders burned. Eli had been quiet all day, more so than usual, which was a threshold that required genuine effort to breach. He'd eaten without comment, sat by the fire without his customary study of the flames, and answered her questions in monosyllables that she'd attributed, with the practiced optimism of a mother in survival mode, to tiredness. By the time the storm hit fully, wind driving hard against the walls, the fire guttering and recovering and guttering again, the temperature dropping with a speed that felt aggressive, intentional, he was already on his feet, standing in the center of the shelter with his arms slightly out from his sides, his eyes open, staring at nothing. Eli. No response. Eli. She was across the room in 3 steps, hands on his shoulders, and stopped. He was burning, not with fever. She'd felt fever, the wet, miserable heat of a sick child. This was different. This was dry and deep and radiating from somewhere beneath his skin, as if something inside him had been lit from within like a lantern. His small body was rigid under her hands. His face was slack but not peaceful, concentrated somehow, as though every available resource had been redirected inward to manage something vast. Then his knees went. She caught him before he hit the ground, barely. He was heavier than he should have been, or she was more exhausted than she'd admitted, and they went down together in a controlled fall, Mara taking the impact on her knees, pulling him into her lap, pressing 2 fingers to his throat. Pulse. Strong. Unnervingly strong, actually. A deep rhythmic thunder that didn't match the light body she was holding. Eli, look at me. His eyes were closed. His lips were moving. She leaned in close, brushing the hair from his forehead with shaking hands, trying to hear above the howl of the storm against the walls. He was speaking, softly, continuously, in a steady murmur that carried the cadence and structure of language. Sentences, she thought, or something like them, but nothing she could parse. Nothing she had ever heard. Not the trading tongue. Not the old pack dialects. Not anything human. It moved through him like water through a pipe, effortless, unconsidered, as if his sleeping mind was simply translating something it received from elsewhere. She was still trying to process this when the light began. It came from his chest. She saw it through his shirt first, a warm, amber pulse, like a heartbeat made visible, pressing against the fabric from inside. She pulled the collar aside with hands that had gone completely numb and found the source, a mark. On his sternum, centered over his heart. It was not a bruise, not a burn, not anything that injury or illness produced. It was drawn, or rather, it had drawn itself, in lines of deep gold that pulsed with his heartbeat, each beat sending the light out to the edges of the symbol for drawing it back to the center. The design was complex and old-looking, the way that certain things announce their age without requiring translation. The same quality as standing stones and root systems and the deep patterns worn into riverbeds by centuries of water, all interlocking curves and angular interruptions. A crest of some kind with a shape at its center that her wolf instincts processed before her mind caught up. A crown. Something in her, beneath the fear, beneath the rational cataloging of impossible things, recognized it. Not the way you recognize a face or a word. The way you recognize a sound that stops you cold on the street because something in your body remembers it, even though your mind has never heard it before. A bone-deep, instinctive recognition that arrived without information attached. Just the raw signal. This matters. This is real. This is very, very old. Then Eli's eyes opened. They were gold. Not amber. Not the warm, familiar amber she had looked into every day of his life. Gold. Molten and lit from within, the pupils still dark but surrounded by a luminance that had no business existing in the eyes of a 6-year-old boy in a ruin in a frozen wilderness. He looked at her and through her and past her at something she couldn't see. And then the light crested, the mark blazing, the eyes blazing, the impossible heat of him spiking sharply enough that she felt it on her face like an open flame. And then it was gone, all of it, at once, like a candle snuffed. Eli blinked. His eyes were amber again. The mark on his chest faded to a faint, warm trace that she might, in a different light, have told herself was a shadow. He looked up at her face, and his brow furrowed slightly. "Mama, why are you crying?" She hadn't known she was. "Are you hurt?" she managed. He considered this with characteristic seriousness, conducting a brief internal inventory. "No?" Then with a child's guileless precision, "Why are you holding me on the floor? You fell?" "Oh." He accepted this without distress. "I don't remember falling." "What do you remember?" A long pause. He looked at the fire. And the storm battered the walls around them, and he sat in her lap in the low golden light and thought about her question with the same focused patience he brought to everything. "Nothing," he said finally. "Just nothing. Like a very quiet sleep." She held him until he actually slept, until his breathing deepened and his body lost the last of that uncanny rigidity, and he became simply a small boy again, heavy and warm and ordinary, tucked against her side with his hand loosely fisted in the fabric of her shirt. Then she went to the satchel. It was the only thing she'd grabbed from the burning house that hadn't been purely practical. Not food, not tools, not her hunting knife. She'd grabbed it from the hook beside the door without thinking. The way you grab things that have lived in your periphery so long they've become part of the architecture of home. It had been Davin's. He'd left it behind when he died, and she'd kept it, because getting rid of it had always felt like a decision that required more of her than she could spare. She'd gone through it once, in the early weeks after his death, found nothing of significance, a folded map, a spare buckle, the ordinary debris of a life interrupted. She hadn't gone through it since. Now she turned it inside out, methodically, with the focused precision of a woman who had just watched her son light up like a sacred text and was no longer willing to accept that she knew everything she needed to know. Her fingers found the lining, the seam, the slight irregularity in the stitching that she'd noticed before and dismissed as wear. She pulled. The letter was folded small and wrapped in oilskin, protecting it from moisture, from time, from the accidental discovery of a woman who wasn't supposed to need it yet. The seal was intact. She cracked it with her thumbnail and unfolded the paper with hands that were, if she was being precise about it, trembling. Davin's handwriting, unmistakably. The particular slant of his letters, the way he bore down too hard on certain words, as if emphasizing them to an imagined reader. The damage was extensive, water or time or both. Entire paragraphs reduced to blurred gray smears, sentences dissolving mid-word, meaning swallowed by decay. She turned it toward the firelight and read what remained with the desperate focus of someone deciphering a map to a place she was already standing. Fragments. Pieces of a confession she hadn't known she needed. His name. Eli's name. Words she couldn't assemble into coherence because too much of the connective tissue was gone. And then, near the bottom, where the damage thinned, One passage intact, preserved by some accident of folding, protected from the water by being pressed flat against the oilskin at exactly the right angle. She read it twice, 3 times. Then she sat back on her heels in the firelight and listened to her son breathe, and the storm rage and the old ruins hold, as they had held for longer than anyone living could remember. If the mark ever wakes, run. Not from the enemies, from the alphas, all of them. The fire crackled. The storm pressed against the walls. Eli slept with his hand still loosely fisted in the fabric at her side. Mara folded the letter, and Mara tucked it against her chest, and sat in the dark with the weight of an incomplete truth. The worst kind. The kind with enough shape to terrify you, and not enough detail to help, and understood that whatever life she had been surviving toward, it was not the one she had imagined. She had been keeping her son at the edge of everything to protect him. But the edge, it turned out, had its own gravity, and something old and gold and impossibly patient, had found them there anyway. Chapter 5. A pack is not a building. It does not crack from the outside in, from weather or force or the pressure of external threat. A pack fractures from within, along the invisible fault lines that form wherever loyalty meets doubt, wherever obedience meets conscience, wherever the story a community tells about itself begins to diverge from the facts on the ground. Ironvale had been telling itself a story. By the time the third body was found, the story had developed a problem. The third wolf's name was Corin, 42 years old, a mid-ranked hunter, experienced, cautious, the kind of wolf who did not take unnecessary risks in the borderlands and had 20 years of field work to prove it. Found on a Tuesday morning, 3 miles northeast of where Fenric had been found, in a kill pattern so similar to the first two that the tracker who discovered him stood over the body for a full minute before he could make himself reach for the signal horn. Same wounds, same feral signature, same message written in the snow, in the language of something enormous and uncontrolled. The same message, for the third time. Mara had been in the wilderness for 19 days. The mathematics were not complicated. They were, in fact, brutally simple, the kind of simple that doesn't require analysis, only the willingness to look directly at the sum. A woman banished to the frozen wilderness with a small child and no supplies could not, by any reasonable physical accounting, have traveled 70 miles round trip through winter terrain to execute a sophisticated kill on a seasoned hunter. Mwe then returned to her exile without leaving a single traceable print. The lower-ranking wolves had started doing the mathematics 2 bodies ago. Now, standing over a third, they were doing them out loud. It began as whispers. It always begins as whispers. The preferred medium of communities that aren't yet ready to commit to the volume of an accusation. Doesn't add up. At the hunter's fire, voices low, eyes watching the door, she was out there with nothing. Nobody survives out there with nothing, let alone hunts this cleanly while doing it. Agreement in the silence, in the careful nods, in the way the conversation paused whenever a ranked wolf walked past and resumed the moment they were clear. Someone should say something. Someone should. You going to? The pause that followed that particular exchange contained in compressed form the entire history of hierarchical power and the cost of challenging it. Alpha Kalem heard the whispers the way he heard most things, fully, immediately, and without visible reaction. He sat in the packed council chamber on the morning after Corin's discovery and listened to his inner circle arrange itself around the table, and he read the room with the practiced precision of a man who had spent a decade learning to understand what his wolves weren't saying. What they weren't saying was loud. He let the silence stretch a beat past comfortable before he spoke, calm, measured, his voice landing in the room like a hand laid flat on a table, present, deliberate, not yet a fist. The investigation continues, he said. We expand the border patrols, we increase watch rotations. We do not speculate. 3 of the 6 council members held his gaze. 3 looked at the table. That was new. Draven noticed the table lookers too. Kalem's beta was a grizzled, broad-shouldered wolf somewhere in his mid-50s, with a gray threaded beard and the kind of eyes that were always doing 2 calculations simultaneously, the visible one and the one underneath. He had served 4 years as beta and worn the role like a second skin, managing the pack's political undercurrents, with a competence that Calum had always valued and a thoroughness that he had never fully examined. After the council session, Draven moved through Ironvale with a focused efficiency that a casual observer might have read as diligence. A closer observer might have read as something else. He visited 3 lower-ranking wolves before noon. Each conversation was brief. Each ended with the wolf in question looking somewhat smaller than they had at the start of it. Not threatened exactly. Simply reminded in the precise and unambiguous language of pack hierarchy, of their position within it and the various ways that position could become less comfortable. The whispers didn't stop, but they quieted, and they moved indoors. Senna watched Draven's rounds from across the market square and filed away what she saw with the same wordless precision she applied to tracking. She was 26, lean and brown-haired, with a tracker's habitual quietness, the kind of stillness that came not from timidity, but from training, from years of learning that the most important information in any environment arrived to those who made the least noise. What she held a mid-rank warrior position that she'd earned without political assistance, which in Ironvale's hierarchy was a minor distinction that nonetheless meant something to the people who understood how the ranking system worked. She had not been part of the council that condemned Mara. She had not been among the column that rode to the burning. She had been on a 3-day border rotation, and she had come back to a pack that had changed shape while she was gone, and she had not said the things she thought about it because she was 26 and mid-ranked, and not yet certain that what she thought was worth the cost of saying it out loud. But she watched. She had always watched, and she tracked. She followed the kill patterns on her own time, off rotation, without reporting her movements, which was a minor infraction of patrol protocol that she had decided she could live with. The pattern was consistent enough, once you mapped it, to suggest not randomness, but territory. Something was moving in a roughly northern arc, staying close to the borderlands, hitting specific points along the tree line with a regularity that felt almost like a route. She followed the route. It led her north and east into terrain that thinned from maintained pack territory into the older, unmapped lands, the places the current generation of Ironvale wolves treated as dead space, borderlands in the truest sense, belonging to no one, and therefore avoided by everyone. On the 4th day of her independent investigation, she found the ruins. She approached slowly, reading the ground with the tracker's vocabulary, the compressed snow that spoke of regular foot traffic, the cleared perimeter that spoke of deliberate maintenance, the subtle reorganization of fallen timber that spoke of a person who understood how to make abandoned things useful. A fire had been burning here, recently. The ash was fresh enough to smell. Someone was living here. 2 someones, she corrected, crouching over a set of smaller prints near the eastern wall, child-sized, overlapping with the adult prints in the pattern of a child staying close to an adult, not being held, choosing proximity. The prints were old friends with each other. She stood in the ruined shadow for a long moment and felt the architecture of Ironvale's recent history rearrange itself around this single data point. Alive, both of them. Surviving, genuinely surviving, not merely lingering. She moved the perimeter, reading the older signs, and then she found the tracks. They were enormous, not Mara's. She'd already mapped Mara's prints, knew their depth and spacing, the particular weight distribution of a wolf woman who moved efficiently and without waste. These were something else entirely. 4-pawed, lupin in structure, but scaled in a way that stopped her cold. The stride length alone suggested a wolf 3 times the size of any Ironvale pack member she had ever encountered. The depth of the impression in the hard pack, even accounting for days of settling snow, indicated mass that she couldn't place in any living classification she'd been trained on. She crouched beside the track and stayed there for a moment, very still, in the way that good trackers go still when they've found something that the existing map doesn't account for. Old was the word that arrived. Not in age of the print, these were recent, but in quality. In the same way that the ruins themselves were old, the way the territory was old, something that predated the current order of things. She followed the tracks to the edge of the ruin wall and lost them, where the snow had drifted and refilled. She was straightening up, recalibrating, when she saw the ember. It was in the snow, beside the base of the oldest wall, the collapsed section, the part that had fallen so long ago the stones had sunk partially into the frost-hard ground. Small, perhaps the size of her thumbnail, and still, inexplicably, glowing. A soft pulse of gold in the gray-white landscape, defying the cold with a serenity that had no physical explanation. Snow within a centimeter of it remained snow, unmelted, undisturbed. It burned without heat. It persisted without fuel. Senna stared at it for a long time. Then she took the folded cloth from her breast pocket, the one she used for tracking samples, wrapped the ember carefully, and placed it in the inner pocket closest to her chest. She stood. She looked at the ruins one final time, at the evidence of a woman's survival, a child's footprints, the ancient tracks, the impossible ember, and she made the first of what would become a series of decisions that the pack's history would eventually judge as either extraordinary courage or extraordinary recklessness, depending on who was telling the story. She would not go to Keelam, not yet. Not until she understood what she was bringing him. Not until she knew whether the thing she was carrying in her breast pocket was a key or a detonator. She turned south and walked back toward Ironvale, and the ember glowed faintly through the layers of cloth against her chest like a second heartbeat, patient and golden and entirely unconcerned with the cold. Behind her, the ruins held their silence, and somewhere inside them, a boy with ancient eyes slept lightly, as he always did, listening to something no one else could hear. Chapter 6. There are things that get removed from history not because they aren't true, but because they are too true, too disruptive, too dangerous, too capable of unraveling the careful architecture of power that someone spent considerable effort constructing. Ironvale's official histories were thorough, precise, maintained by the pack's record keepers, with the kind of devotion that suggested the histories mattered enormously to someone. It was the gaps that Senna had never thought to look at, until now. Elder Voss lived at the northern edge of the pack settlement, in a house that had been built around her rather than by her, added to, modified, adjusted over decades by a succession of younger wolves who understood that she was not going to move, and that the alternative was to let the pack's oldest living memory sit in inadequate shelter, which no one with any sense was willing to do. She was ancient in the way that certain trees are ancient, not frail, not diminished, but compressed, the way things become when they have survived long enough to shed everything inessential and arrive at something closer to pure material. Small and white-haired and blind since her 5th decade, with eyes the color of old smoke that moved with unsettling accuracy toward whatever she was paying attention to, as if the loss of one kind of sight had simply redirected her attention to something more reliable. She had lived through 4 alpha reigns. She had outlasted wars, border disputes, 3 plague seasons, and the particular ongoing catastrophe of powerful men making decisions they weren't wise enough to make. She had stopped attending pack councils sometime in the last decade, not because she'd been excluded, but because she'd looked at the assembled faces and apparently decided the return on her investment was no longer adequate. She received visitors on her own terms, in her own time, and had been known to send ranked wolves away at the door with a brevity that no one challenged because she was Voss, and she had earned every syllable of every short sentence she had ever deployed. When Senna knocked, the door opened before the second knock landed. "I've been waiting," Voss said. "Come in before you let the cold in with you." The interior was warm and close, lit by several oil lamps and organized with the confident precision of a person who had memorized every inch of the space and required nothing to change. Books lined 2 walls, old ones, the kind with covers worn soft by decades of handling. Senna recognized some titles. Others she'd never seen, bound in materials she couldn't identify, labeled in a script that wasn't the current pack standard. She sat in the chair Voss gestured her toward without looking at it. The elder settled across from her, folded her hands in her lap, and turned those smoke-colored eyes directly toward Senna's breast pocket. "You found something," Voss said. Not a question. "I found several things." Senna reached into her pocket, unfolded the cloth, held it out across the low table between them. The ember still glowed, steadily, softly unchanged from the moment she'd lifted it from the snow beside the ruins, warm gold against the gray cloth, patient as a held breath. Voss didn't reach for it immediately. She sat very still for a moment, her head tilted slightly, as if listening to something Senna couldn't hear. Then, with a deliberateness that felt ceremonial, she extended both hands and cupped them around the ember without touching it, holding the heat of it, or whatever it was that the ember was emitting, between her palms. She went rigid, not the rigidity of shock or pain, nothing convulsive, nothing dramatic. The absolute stillness of a person receiving information at a volume that requires everything else to stop. Her blind eyes went wide, her breathing shallowed. The lamplight caught the lines of her face, and for a moment she looked simultaneously older than Senna had ever seen her, and younger, as if whatever the ember was transmitting had reached back through her years and touched something that remembered. The silence lasted long enough for Senna to consider speaking and decide against it 3 separate times. Then Voss lowered her hands, slowly, set them back in her lap, and whispered 2 words, the Ashen Crown. The name landed in the warm room like something dropped from a great height. Not loud, but weighted. It displaced the air around it. It changed the quality of the silence that followed. Senna felt it move through her the way cold moves through inadequate clothing, finding every gap, settling into every undefended place. I don't know that name, she said carefully. No, Voss agreed. You wouldn't. You're too young. And it was removed. Removed. From the records, from the teaching histories, from the council archives. A pause. 20 years ago, on the order of the Alpha at the time, with the full cooperation of every ranked pack leader in the Northern Territories. Her mouth formed something that was not quite a smile. Cooperation is easy to obtain when the alternative is being the pack that harbors a bloodline capable of dismantling everything you've built. Senna leaned forward. What bloodline? And Voss told her. The story arrived not in the linear, documented fashion of an official history, but in the layered, associative way of genuine memory, pieces connecting to pieces, context arriving alongside content, the emotional register of a woman who had been alive when these events occurred and had spent 20 years sitting with the weight of having survived them, before the current Alpha system, before the territorial boundaries that the Northern Packs treated as permanent and had always been provisional, before the hierarchy of bloodline rank had calcified into the structure that wolves like Calum had inherited and wolves like Mara had suffered under. There had been something older, a single lineage, unaffiliated with any territorial pack. Older than the pack system itself, born from the first generation of wolves who had understood that the power to shift was not merely physical but something adjacent to the sacred, that it carried in its oldest expression an authority that transcended the politics of territory and rank. They were called, in the oldest texts, the ones that had not been removed because no one currently living had known they existed, the Ashen Bloodline, the crowned wolves, and the mark of their lineage, which manifested only in the air of each generation, was called the Ashen Crown, a living symbol, encoded in the blood, that woke when the air was ready. When the mark woke, the old law was clear. All pack authority suspended until the bloodline was acknowledged. Not a political courtesy, not a tradition, a law. Older than Ironvale, older than the concept of an alpha title. Encoded in the collective wolf memory so deeply that it operated below conscious loyalty. It was the reason, Voss said, that every alpha in the Northern Territories had agreed to erase the history. Not because they disbelieved it, because they believed it completely. The last Ashen Heir, Voss continued, her voice low and even, was a man named Davin. The name hit Senna like a physical thing. She kept her face still, barely. He was the son of the previous Ashen King, a man who died without ever revealing his heir publicly, because by then the Alphas had begun their campaign of erasure, and the assassination attempts had already started. Voss's blind eyes were steady, looking somewhere past Senna's shoulder at something only she could see. Davin understood what he carried. He understood what his child would carry. So he did the only thing the old bloodline had never done before. He hid. He hid in plain sight, Senna said slowly. in a pack as a ranked wolf. As an ordinary man with an ordinary life, Voss nodded once. He chose his mate with great care, not for rank or bloodline, but for the quality of her strength, her discretion, her capacity to protect something she didn't fully understand. A pause, weighted and precise. He chose a dark-haired woman with amber eyes. He mated her quietly, without fanfare. He gave her a child. The fire in the grate popped softly. And then, Voss said, he died. Before he could tell her everything. Before the mark woke and made the telling urgent. The silence that followed was complete. Senna sat in it and felt the entire architecture of the last several weeks. The bodies, the banishment, Draven's aggressive silencing of doubt, the ember glowing in the snow beside ruins soaked in old magic, click into a new and devastating configuration. She thought about the enormous wolf tracks in the snow, about the quality of them, the word that had arrived unbidden when she crouched beside them. Old. The heir, she said, and her voice came out quieter than she'd intended. The mark wakes in the child, not Davin, the next generation. Always the next generation? Voss confirmed. The mark cannot be forced, cannot be rushed. It wakes when it wakes, when the heir is ready, when the need is sufficient, when the bloodline decides the time has come. Senna stared at the ember, still glowing softly in the cloth between them. Thought about a small boy's footprints overlapping with his mother's in the snow. About a woman surviving in the wilderness with nothing, keeping her child alive, keeping herself between him and everything. How old, she said almost to herself. Would the child be now? Voss turned her smoke-colored eyes directly towards Senna, with an accuracy that, as always, suggested her blindness was more selective than absolute, and she smiled. It was a slow thing, old and knowing and carrying within it the particular satisfaction of a woman who had been waiting 20 years for this specific conversation. About the age of a boy, she said. Senna left before the hour was out, the ember back in her breast pocket, its warmth steady against her sternum, as she walked through Iron Vale Wall's cold streets with her face composed and her mind moving at a speed that her expression gave nothing away. She passed Draven in the market square. He glanced at her, a brief assessor's glance, cataloging and filing. She nodded the way mid-ranked warriors nodded at betas. Neutral, routine, entirely unremarkable. He moved on. She kept walking, and her hand, beneath her cloak, pressed once against her breast pocket, against the golden light that had been glowing without fuel in the snow beside the ruins of an old border outpost, waiting, with the patience of something that had already waited a very long time for someone to finally pick it up. The history books had buried the name, but names, it turned out, did not stay buried, not when the bloodline decided it was time. Chapter 7. There is a moment before violence when the air changes. Predators know it. Prey knows it. The body registers it before the mind catches up. A tightening at the base of the skull. A drop in the stomach. Every fine hair rising in the wordless biological grammar of something is coming, and it is not coming in peace. Mara woke to that feeling at the 3rd hour past midnight. She was on her feet before she was fully conscious, moving to Eli's side by instinct, her hand on his shoulder before her eyes had adjusted to the dark. He was already awake, already sitting up, already looking at the entrance to the shelter with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Not fear, not confusion, but a settled, terrible calm, as if some part of him recognized what was arriving and had been expecting it for a very long time. "How many?" she asked quietly. 6, he said. "Maybe 7. They've been outside the perimeter for a while. They were waiting for something." She stared at him. "How do you—" "I can hear them breathing." She couldn't, and she was the trained wolf. She moved him behind her and took position near the wall. They came through the tree line in a loose arc, 7 of them, as Eli had said, moving with the coordinated silence of wolves who had done this before and been paid to do it well. Not feral, not rogue in the disorganized sense. These were contracted wolves, purpose-built and directed, wearing the particular controlled aggression of professional violence. Mara read all of this in the first 4 seconds and understood 2 things with cold, crystalline clarity. First, they were outnumbered in a way that made conventional defense a losing calculation. Second, they were not positioned to kill. They were positioned to extract. The arc of their approach was designed to separate, to isolate, to create a corridor, and the corridor pointed away from her and toward Eli. They were not here for her. "Stay behind me," she said. Her voice came out flat and absolute. The voice she hadn't used since the borderlands at the edge of Ironvale, when 2 ranked wolves had taken her arms and she'd gotten an elbow free and felt it connect. The voice that lived below grief and above fear in the register of a woman who has nothing left to protect except the one thing that matters. The first wolf came through the shelter entrance without preamble. Mara met him before he'd fully cleared the doorframe. What followed was not graceful. It was not the choreographed combat of ranked warrior wolves with training and space and the luxury of preparation. It was a woman in a confined space, in the dark, fighting with every adaptation 6 weeks of wilderness. Survival had stripped her down to. Economical, ferocious, operating on the math of buying seconds rather than winning engagements. She took the first wolf down with his own momentum, using the doorframe as leverage, and was already moving before he hit the ground. The second came in low. She went lower. The third caught her across the shoulder, with enough force to slam her into the wall, and she felt something give in a way that was going to become information later, in the aftermath, if there was an aftermath. But right now, it was just data, filed and set aside, because stopping to feel it was not an option she had. She bought 30 seconds. She bought a minute. She bled through her sleeve and didn't look at it. She put 2 of them on the ground and felt the other 5 regroup, with the patient efficiency of wolves who had expected resistance and planned for it. They were better than her. More of them. Rested, equipped, coordinated. She knew, with the specific clarity of someone who has stopped lying to themselves in order to survive, that she was losing. And then Eli said very quietly, from directly behind her, "Mama, step back." "Eli, stay, please." Something in the word stopped her. Not the please, though in 6 years she had never heard him use that precise tone, that weight, that quality of asking as an equal, rather than appealing as a child. What stopped her was the air. The air had changed again. Not the before violence change, something older than that. Something that had no name in the vocabulary of pack training or Borderlands experience or anything she had ever encountered in her life. The temperature didn't drop. It deepened, as if the cold became more itself, as if the night decided to be more thoroughly night. She stepped back. Eli walked forward, dark-haired, small enough that the nearest rogue wolf looked down at him with an expression that crossed confusion with the beginning of something more complicated. That expression lasted approximately 2 seconds. The mark woke first, blazing through his shirt with a light that was not amber this time, not the soft pulse of the sleeping things she'd seen on that stormy night. This was a conflagration, gold and ancient and furious. The ashen crown symbol burning so bright it threw shadows backward, illuminating the ruins in a warm, terrible radiance that made every wolf present take an involuntary step away from their own volition. Then, Eli shifted. Later, Mara would try to find words for it. She would attempt the description dozens of times, in the quiet hours, and always arrive at the same inadequacy. That language had been built to describe the world as it existed before this moment, and was therefore structurally unequipped for what happened next. The ground cracked. Not metaphorically. Hairline fractures spider-webbed outward from the point where Eli stood, radiating through the frost-packed earth in a pattern that matched precisely the lines of the ashen crown mark, as if the shift was not contained within his body, but expressed through the ground beneath him, as if the earth itself was participating. The air pressure dropped. Senna, still half a mile out and running hard through the dark pines, felt it as a sudden, dense silence. The forest holding its breath. The hired wolves inside the ruins felt it as something close to gravity. The light was extraordinary, Where a small boy had stood, something else stood now, massive, not in the scaled-up way of a large pack wolf, but in a way that suggested a different category of animal entirely, a different order of being. Ghost white, every strand of fur carrying that gold-burning luminance at its edges, so that the whole shape of the creature seemed outlined in living fire. The ashen crown mark blazed on its chest even in wolf form, impossible, unprecedented, a thing that the old text described but that no living wolf had witnessed, and the eyes were full molten gold, steady and ancient, and carrying within them a consciousness that was not diminished by the shift but clarified by it. The ruins felt small around it, the hired wolves scattered, not in the organized retreat of professionals recalculating odds, in the absolute instinctive flight of animals encountering something that exists outside their threat response programming, something their bodies recognized as fundamentally beyond the frameworks of pack hierarchy and contracted violence and every metric by which they had previously organized their understanding of danger. They were gone in seconds. Into the tree line, into the dark. Running without looking back, the great white wolf turned, found Mara, and the gold eyes softened. That was the detail that undid her, not the magnitude of it, not the impossible luminance, or the cracked earth, or the vanishing of 7 professional wolves as if they'd been unmade. The softening. The way those ancient, blazing eyes found her face and became, without losing any of their power, gentle, recognizing her, choosing her. Standing between her and the entrance to the ruins with a protectiveness so complete and so quiet that it required no display. She dropped to her knees in the snow, not in submission. Her legs simply made the decision without consulting her, responding to something that bypassed rational processing entirely. She pressed both hands over her mouth and felt the tears come, not the controlled, strategic absence of tears she had maintained since the burning, not the locked-away grief of a woman who couldn't afford to feel things. These were different. These came from a place below strategy, below survival, below the careful architecture of a woman who had been holding everything together by will, alone for 6 weeks in a frozen wilderness. This is my son. The thought arrived without grammar, without the structure of language. This is what I was protecting. This is what he is. The wolf stepped closer, lowered its great head, and rested it with extraordinary gentleness against her hair. She held it there, both arms going around the thick, white neck, her face pressed into luminous fur, not her whole body shaking with the force of something that was not entirely grief and not entirely relief, but existed in the specific territory between them where truth lives. 70 miles south, in the great hall of Ironvale, Alpha Calum stood up from his chair. He had not been asleep. He had not been at peace enough for sleep. In some weeks now, he had been sitting in the hall with a cup of something cold in the specific company of a man who is beginning to understand the full weight of what he has done, but has not yet found the architecture to hold that understanding. The pulse arrived without warning. It moved through the pack bond like a stone dropped into still water, concentric rings of old magic, older than Ironvale, older than the concept of an alpha title, or radiating outward from a point northeast of the territory and passing through every wolf in the northern lands with the unhurried authority of something that had never needed permission. The cup hit the floor. He didn't notice. He stood in his great hall with the crown on his silver hair and the blood draining from his face, and he felt the old law move through him like a key turning in a lock he hadn't known was there. Ancient, irrefutable, demanding. The Ashen Crown had woken, and Calum, for the first time in a decade of absolute certainty, had no idea what to do next. Chapter 8, Truth. Once released, does not negotiate. It does not wait for convenient timing. It does not soften itself for the comfort of the people it dismantles. It moves at its own pace, in its own direction, with the complete indifference of a thing that has simply been waiting, behind a wall, beneath a floor, inside a sealed letter in the lining of a dead man's satchel, for the precise moment when the structure built to contain it finally develops a crack wide enough to let it through. By dawn, the crack had become a canyon. The pulse had moved through every wolf in the northern territories while they slept, and not one of them had slept through it. In 3 neighboring pack territories, alphas had woken, in the dark with the old law singing in their blood, ancient, irresistible, a frequency their bodies recognized before their minds could dismiss it. By first light, riders were already moving between packs. Conversations that had not been had in 20 years were being had urgently, in low voices behind closed doors, by people who had spent 2 decades pretending a thing did not exist, and were now confronting the fact that the thing had opinions about that. The Ashen Crown had woken, the air had shifted, and every political structure in the Northern Territories, every carefully maintained hierarchy, every alliance, every treaty built on the assumption that the old bloodline was extinct, was now sitting on a foundation that had overnight become provisional. Senna reached the ruins 20 minutes after the shift. She had been running since the pulse hit her, not toward initially just running, the way your body moves when it receives information too large for stillness, and then toward deliberately, with the specific urgency of a woman who had been carrying pieces of this puzzle for days and had just felt the last piece slot into place from 50 miles away. She came through the tree line into the ruin clearing and stopped. The ground was cracked. Radiating outward from a central point in the pattern she recognized from Voss's description, the precise geometry of the Ashen Crown expressed in fractured earth. The snow around the cracks had a faint golden cast, as if the light from the shift had stained it. Mara was sitting against the outer wall with Eli in her lap, back in his small, dark-haired, entirely ordinary-looking human form, his head against her shoulder, his eyes tracking Senna's approach with that ancient watchfulness. Her arm was around him. Her face was the face of a woman who had been through several things in the last hour that would have broken someone with less structural integrity. Senna crossed the clearing and knelt. Not a warrior's courtesy nod, not the minimal acknowledgement of rank to rank. She went to one knee in the cracked snow before a 6-year-old boy in a worn shirt with the deliberate, full-weight genuflection of someone enacting something that mattered, that had always mattered, whether or not the world had been ready to admit it. Eli stared at her. "Why are you doing that?" "Because it's right," Senna said simply. She rose, met Mara's eyes. "I need to tell you some things. I think you already know some of them." "Tell me anyway," Mara said. She told her everything. Voss, the Ember, the history that had been erased, the bloodline older than pack law, Davin's true identity, not a ranked Iron Veil wolf who had died in a border incident, but the last Ashen Heir, hidden in plain sight, choosing the woman he chose for every right reason, dying before he could give her the full truth of what she was protecting. Mara listened without interrupting. Her face gave very little away, the controlled stillness of a woman who had learned, in the hardest possible school, to process enormous things internally, before allowing them any external expression. But her hand, resting on Eli's back, pressed slightly harder as the story progressed. And once, just once, when Senna said Davin's name in the context of royalty, the Ashen King's son, the hidden heir, something moved across Mara's face that was too complex and too private to name. When Senna finished, the clearing was quiet except for the distant sound of the forest settling in the early morning cold. "He knew," Mara said. Not a question, not quite an accusation. The flat, careful tone of a woman picking up something sharp and deciding how to hold it. "He knew all of it, and he chose not to tell me." "He chose to protect you," Senna said carefully. "The assassination attempts. He chose to leave me without the information I needed to protect our son." Mara's voice was even, precise. "Those aren't the same thing." Senna had no answer for that, because it was true. Eli, who had been listening with the complete attention he brought to everything, looked up at his mother's face. "Is that why you always said I wasn't what they said I was?" Mara looked at him for a long moment. "I said it because it was true. I didn't know how true." He considered this, nodded once, in the manner of someone filing information appropriately, then leaned his head back against her shoulder and watched the tree line with gold-flecked eyes. Caleb came alone. No column, no silver-cloaked formation, no armor beyond what he'd ridden in, and even that looked different, without the performance of a rival behind it, without the machinery of alpha authority organizing itself around him. He came through the tree line on horseback and dismounted at the clearing's edge, and he stood there for a moment, looking at the cracked ground, the golden cast snow, the evidence of what had happened while Ironvale slept, and he had sat in his great hall, feeling the old law move through his blood like a verdict. Then he looked at Mara. She was already standing. She had seen him coming, of course she had, and she had handed Eli to Senna with a quiet word and positioned herself in the center of the clearing with her arms at her sides and her amber eyes level. No posturing, no performance, just a woman standing her ground in the ruins she had rebuilt, in the territory she had survived in, with the ash ghost of his injustice still written somewhere in the set of her jaw and the steadiness of her gaze. He crossed the clearing and stopped 6 feet from her. The distance was not accidental. He opened his mouth. She watched him do it. Watched the words fail to materialize. Watched the man who had delivered her sentence without hesitation, without question, without a single moment of doubt, stand before her in the cold morning light and find that the vocabulary of certainty had entirely abandoned him. Good, some part of her thought. Let him feel the size of it. He stopped, started again. There is nothing I can say that is sufficient. No, she agreed. There isn't. He held her gaze without flinching. She would give him that. He didn't look away. He stood in the full weight of what he had done and what he was looking at. A woman who had survived his verdict, who had kept his pack's most significant secret alive through sheer unassisted will, whose child was the living fulfillment of a law older than his title. And he didn't dress it up or deflect it or reach for the tools of authority to manage it. The real killer, he said. I need you to know that when I find out who, Draven. Senna's voice from the edge of the clearing. Flat, certain. Caleb turned. It had been the ember that confirmed it ultimately. Voss. When Senna had described Draven's too aggressive silencing of the pack's doubts, had made a connection that Senna had then cross-referenced with the kill pattern's precise geography, each death positioned, not randomly but strategically, at points along the border that would maximize suspicion toward the outermost rim, toward Mara, calculated, pre-planned. Draven had known about the Bloodline, had known for years, had been, Voss believed, one of the ranked wolves present when the Erasure Order was given 2 decades ago, young enough then to be peripheral, old enough now to understand exactly what Davin's child represented to his own carefully accumulated influence. A unified bloodline meant a unified authority, one that superseded beta rank, pack politics, 20 years of positioning. He had framed Mara to remove her, and Eli with her, before the shift could happen, before the old law could wake, before the crown that could not be uncrowned had the chance to blaze into existence and render everything he'd built irrelevant. He had been thorough. He had been patient. He had been, for 6 weeks, entirely successful, until a 6-year-old boy stepped forward in a ruined shelter to protect his mother. They found Draven at the southern border with a horse and enough provisions for a long ride. He had felt the pulse, too, and he had understood, with the specific intelligence of a man who had spent decades calculating odds, exactly what it meant for him. He didn't make it past the border. Calem's wolves, the ones Senna had quietly mobilized in the 3 hours between the pulse and Calem's ride north, were already there. He was brought back through Ironvale in the gray morning light, without his beta insignia. The wolves who lined the path to watch him pass were the same wolves who had watched Mara dragged from her burning home 6 weeks ago. They were very quiet. But the quality of the silence was entirely different this time. In the ruins, the cracked ground caught the first light of a winter sun, the gold still faintly luminous in the fractured earth, patient and unhurried, the way things are when they know they have already won. Eli watched the light move across the snow, from his place at the wall. His eyes were amber again, warm and quiet and carrying their habitual depth. What happens now? He asked. Mara looked at Senna. Senna looked at Mara. Now, Mara said, with the careful tone of a woman who had learned not to make promises she couldn't yet keep. The world decides whether it's ready. Eli considered this for a moment. Is it? The ruins were quiet around them. The golden light continued its patient work on the cracked ground. It doesn't really get a choice, Mara said. Chapter 9. There is a difference between an apology and a reckoning. An apology is something you offer, something you construct carefully, present at a time of your choosing in language that you have had the luxury of preparing. It lives in the register of the person giving it, shaped by their comfort, their dignity, their need to be understood as someone capable of remorse. A reckoning is something else. A reckoning is what happens when the apology is not enough and everyone present knows it, when the full weight of what was done must be carried into the open and held there, in the light, for as long as it takes for the accounting to be complete. Ironvale was about to have a reckoning. Elder Voss invoked the old law at dawn. She did not ask permission. Permission was not a mechanism the old law recognized. It predated the concept of asking alphas for things, predated the hierarchy that had spent 20 years pretending the law didn't exist. Voss simply spoke the words, in the old tongue, in the center of Ironvale's gathering circle, and every wolf in the territory felt them land in their bones with the authority of something that had always been true and was simply, finally, being said aloud again. When the Ashen Crown wakes, all pack law suspends until the bloodline is acknowledged. The gathering was not optional. That was the nature of the old law. It did not invite, it summoned. And the wolves of Ironvale came because their blood told them to. Filing into the great gathering circle in the gray mid-morning light, with the particular, subdued quality of people who understood that something irreversible was in motion and that their role now was simply to witness it honestly. The circle filled in silence. Ranked wolves, working wolves, elders, warriors, the full spectrum of Ironvale's hierarchy, arranged not by rank this time, but simply by arrival, standing together in the cold with their breath misting in the air and their eyes moving again and again to the two figures at the circle's center. Mara had dressed that morning with the deliberateness of a woman preparing for something that required her to be entirely herself, no performance, no armor beyond what she actually had. The same clothes she'd survived in, the same dark hair loose now instead of pinned, the same amber eyes that had watched her home burn from the snow. She had not tried to appear diminished or defeated, or any of the things that the pack's memory of her might have expected. She had not tried to appear triumphant either. She stood in the center of the gathering circle and looked at the assembled faces of Ironvale, and felt 6 weeks of wilderness and a lifetime of cold tolerance in the specific compound weight of a woman who has been told she is nothing by people who needed her to be nothing for their own convenience. And she let them see all of it, without softening any of it, because the truth of what had been done to her was not something she was willing to manage for their comfort. Eli stood beside her, small, still, dark-haired and amber-eyed in his ordinary way, wearing the ordinary clothes of a 6-year-old child. He had asked on the ride from the ruins whether he was supposed to do anything. Mara had said, "Just stand beside me." He had nodded as if this were a complete and satisfying instruction, and had been doing it with complete and satisfying commitment ever since. The mark was quiet beneath his shirt, patient, present. The circle waited. Calum entered from the north side, the Alpha's traditional entry point, a detail that felt, under the current circumstances, like a habit whose meaning had not yet caught up with the changed reality around it. He was without his full ceremonial armor. The crown was there. It was always there. But the rest of the performance had been stripped back, and what remained was a tall, silver-haired man walking into a circle of his own wolves to say things that no alpha of Ironvale had ever said in a public gathering. He stopped in the center of the circle 6 feet from Mara and faced her. The silence was absolute. He spoke without preamble. No formal opening, no invocation of his title or his rank. Those were precisely the instruments he was here to set down. 6 weeks ago, I stood at the door of this woman's home and delivered a verdict. No trial, no investigation, no evidence presented, examined, or challenged. His voice was even, carrying to the edges of the circle without requiring volume. I called her a monster. I ordered her home burned. I had her removed from this pack's territory with her child and nothing else, and I returned to this hall and called it justice. A pause. It was not justice. It was the exercise of unchecked power by a man too certain of himself to consider that certainty is not the same as being right. The circle was very still. Mara watched him, said nothing. Let the words exist without rescue, he continued. The full accounting, Draven's manipulation, the manufactured evidence, the pack's complicity through silence, his own refusal to revisit the verdict when the second killing should have made the arithmetic undeniable. He did not minimize. He did not explain in ways that functioned as excuses. He laid it out in the plain, undecorated language of someone who had spent the pre-dawn hours deciding that the only thing he had left to offer was complete honesty, and was now delivering it regardless of what it cost him. When he finished, the silence returned, and then Mara spoke. You want to know what 6 weeks in the wilderness with a 6-year-old and no supplies feels like? Her voice was quiet, steady, carrying its own kind of weight, not anger exactly, though anger was present. Something more composed than anger, something that had been anger and had been refined by time and cold and the ongoing work of survival into something harder and more permanent. It feels like waking up every morning and deciding again that you are going to live. Not because it's easy, not because hope is abundant, because your child is watching you, and the only thing more important than your own exhaustion is what he learns from watching you choose. She let that sit. You took my home. You took my name in this community. You took my son's sense of safety in the only world he'd known. Her eyes held Caleb's without heat and without wavering. You did it without a question, without a moment of doubt, because the system that gave you your crown also gave you the certainty that you didn't need one. I know, Caleb said. It was barely adequate. He knew it. Say it again, Mara said. Not to me, to them. He turned to the circle, and he said it again. Not the summary, not the formal accounting, but the specific, unvarnished admission. I was wrong. I acted without evidence. I let pride function as law. I let a woman and her child be cast into the wilderness to die because it was easier than admitting I might be mistaken. Faces in the circle shifted. Not dramatically. These were wolves bred for composure, but visibly. The particular micro-movement of people absorbing accountability they had been waiting, without knowing they were waiting, to hear expressed out loud. Some of them had watched from the market path. Some had stood in the cold and said nothing. Some had whispered at wells and in doorways, and had told themselves they were not responsible for what the Alpha decided. The reckoning was not only Caleb's. They understood that now. The silence after was different from all the silences before it. Fuller, more honest. The silence of a community in the process of understanding that witnessing injustice without speaking is its own form of participation, and that the accounting for it, while uncomfortable, was the only thing that led anywhere worth going. Mara stood in the center of it and felt something shift in her chest. Not forgiveness, and not yet. Not the clean resolution of a wound that required more time than a single morning in a shrine and a gathering circle, but something adjacent to the possibility of it. The recognition that she had been seen, that the truth of what happened had been spoken, publicly and completely, by the person who needed most to speak it. It was not enough. It was a beginning. Eli moved beside her. She felt his hand before she saw it, small fingers wrapping around her forearm, a child's instinctive reaching for his mother in a moment that was too large for him, and also, in some way, she was only beginning to understand, precisely sized for what he was. The mark woke gently this time. Not the conflagration of the ruins, no cracking ground, no dropped air pressure, no blazing transformation, just a soft, steady gold warm through his shirt, pulsing with his heartbeat in the quiet morning air of the gathering circle, present, certain, entirely unhurried. The nearest wolf went to their knees first, an elder on the left side of the circle, then the warrior beside her, then 2 ranked wolves near the center, then the working wolves, the hunters, the unmated, one by one, and then in clusters, the movement spreading outward, through the circle like the pulse itself, like the gold moving outward from the center of Eli's mark and drawing back in again. The old law moving through Iron Veil blood the way it had always been capable of moving, given the right moment and the right presence to call it forward. The gathering circle went to its knees. Every wolf, every rank, every face that had turned away, every voice that had whispered, and every person who had stood in the cold and said nothing, on their knees now, in the ash-gray snow of a winter morning, before a small, dark-haired boy with gold light on his chest and his mother's hand under his. Calum was the last. He held upright for a moment longer than everyone else, not from defiance, she thought, but from the weight of what it meant. 20 years of absolute authority, a crown worn like a second spine, the complete architecture of a man built around certainty and command, performing its final act of resistance against the thing it had always feared most, the truth that some authority is older than him and does not require his endorsement. Then he went to one knee in the snow. His blue eyes found Mara's face as he descended, and held there from that lowered position, with something in them that was not the frozen certainty she had faced at her burning door. Something rawer. Something that might, given time and the willingness of both parties, eventually become the foundation of something honest. She looked at him. At all of them. At the circle of Iron Veil on its knees in the winter cold, the gold light from her son's chest moving over their bowed heads like a benediction they had not earned but were being offered anyway. She breathed in the cold air, the ash smell of old fire still faint in her memory, even here, even now. She placed her free hand gently on top of Eli's, covered it completely. "Stand up," she said to all of them. "We have work to do." Chapter 10 Fire takes. That is its nature and its purpose, and the only promise it has ever kept with any consistency. It takes wood and fabric and the accumulated physical evidence of a life lived in one place. It takes the east-facing window and the patched roof and the garden that grew more stubbornness than vegetables. It takes the ordinary, irreplaceable architecture of home, the specific weight of a familiar door, the particular creak of a known floorboard, the way a certain corner of a certain room holds warmth differently than the rest. But fire, for all its thoroughness, has never managed to take everything. What it leaves behind is sometimes more significant than what it destroys. Draven's trial lasted 3 days. It was conducted under the old law, which was, in several notable respects, less forgiving than the pack law that had been used to condemn Mara without evidence, without trial, without a single question asked. The old law required complete accounting. Every decision, every action, every moment at which the truth had been available and had been chosen against. He was thorough in his admission, ultimately, not from remorse, Mara suspected, but from the pragmatic recognition that the assembled evidence left no productive alternative. The hired wolves had been found. The payment records existed. The kill pattern's geometry, when mapped precisely and overlaid against Draven's own patrol records, told a story that required no interpretation. He had known about the Bloodline for 20 years. He had positioned himself at Calum's right hand with the specific intention of being present when the Heir emerged, not to protect the old law, but to prevent it. 3 wolves were dead because a man had looked at the future and decided that his position within the current order was worth more than the lives it cost to preserve it. The pack listened to all of it. They were required to, under the old law. Mara attended every session. She sat in the front row with Eli beside her, and she listened to the full accounting of the machinery that had been built to destroy her, and she did not look away from any of it. Because she had decided, somewhere in the wilderness, during the long, cold weeks of surviving toward a morning she hadn't known was coming, that the truth was not something she was willing to be protected from. Not anymore. The truth was the only thing that had ever actually been on her side. Draven was stripped of rank, stripped of pack standing, cast out, formally, legally, under the old law's specific provisions for those who acted against the Ashen bloodline, into the same wilderness he had engineered for Mara, with the same nothing he had sent her out with. The symmetry was not lost on anyone present. The pack's reckoning was slower, more uncomfortable, the kind of process that does not have a clean endpoint. Because its subject matter, the collective moral accounting of a community for what it permitted, what it ignored, what it whispered about instead of speaking aloud, does not resolve in a single session or a single season. Calum initiated it himself, which Mara had not expected and filed away as a data point in the ongoing and cautious reassessment she was conducting of who he was beneath the crown and the certainty. He established a formal process, not punitive, not designed to assign individual blame to wolves who had been operating within the only system they'd been given, but restorative, oriented toward understanding how a community arrives at the place where watching injustice becomes easier than challenging it, oriented toward building the kind of pack where that calculation, the next time it presented itself, came out differently. It was imperfect work, halting and uncomfortable and regularly derailed by the human, the wolf, tendency to want resolution faster than reality provides it. It was also real, and Mara, who had spent enough time with false peace to know the difference, recognized it as such. She participated on her own terms. She was not available for the community's comfort, not interested in performing a forgiveness she hadn't yet completed, not willing to smooth over the rough edges of what had happened for the convenience of people who preferred their reckonings tidy. She was honest when she was angry. She was honest when she was tired. She was, on several occasions, the most difficult person in the room to be. She had decided that was acceptable. Calum came to the building site on a Tuesday. He came alone, as he had developed the habit of doing when he came at all, which was neither frequently enough to be intrusive, nor infrequently enough to pretend he wasn't trying. He stood at the edge of what would eventually be the east wall, and watched her work with the expression of a man who had learned, at considerable cost, that watching without immediately acting was sometimes the more useful form of presence. The new house was going up on a rise at the center of Ironvale's territory, not the outer rim, not the tolerated edge. Mara had been offered several sites and had walked each of them with Eli, who had applied his characteristic seriousness to the evaluation and eventually pointed to the rise and said, with the quiet authority that had become somewhat more expected of him in recent weeks, "This one." She had agreed, because the eastern exposure was excellent, and the ground was solid, and because she was done, in every sense, with edges. "You're doing that wrong," Calum said from the edge of the site. Not condescending, his voice had shed most of its condescension in the last several weeks, with varying degrees of grace, observational. "I've built 3 walls in my life," Mara said, without stopping work. "How many have you built?" A pause. "None." "Then you're not really in a position to have an opinion about the technique." Another pause. Then unexpectedly, "Fair." She looked at him briefly over her shoulder. He was almost smiling. Not the easy, authoritative expression of a man accustomed to having rooms arranged around his mood, but something smaller and less certain, and for that reason, more genuine. She returned to the wall. "You can help, or you can observe. Observing is less useful." He helped. He was, it turned out, not entirely without practical skills, though he had to be corrected twice and accepted the corrections with an effortfulness that suggested the effortlessness was not yet natural, but was at least being consistently attempted. They worked through the afternoon without talking about anything consequential, which was its own kind of progress. This was how it went between them, slowly, with long pauses, with no pretense that the distance would close quickly, or that what had been done could be outpaced by what was being built. It was not a story of easy redemption or uncomplicated second chances. It was 2 people with significant wounds and opposing histories in the same territory, making the daily decision to be honest with each other, and finding that honesty practiced consistently had a slow architecture of its own. Mara did not trust him easily. He did not expect her to. She watched him, instead, assessed the distance between what he said and what he did, and noted, without enthusiasm but without dishonesty, that the distance had been narrowing. It was not love, not yet, perhaps not ever. That was a question that lived too far down the road to see clearly from where she was standing. But it was the thing that preceded any possibility of love, 2 people seeing each other accurately, without the distortions of hierarchy or assumption, and choosing to continue looking anyway. That was enough for now. That was more than she'd had before. Eli's destiny was handled with a care that Mara enforced personally and completely. There were delegations from the other northern territories, alphas and elders and representatives, arriving with the careful diplomacy of people who had felt the pulse and understood its implications, and were not entirely certain of their welcome. Mara met them at the settlement's edge, with Senna at her right hand and Elder Voss's words memorized as thoroughly as her own heartbeat. Jan, he is 6 years old. She said it to every delegation, with the same even precision, until it became a kind of policy. He is not a symbol. He is not a political instrument. He is not available for your timeline or your agenda. He will grow. He will learn. He will come into what he is at the pace that is right for him, under the guidance of the people who actually know him. When that time arrives, the old law will speak for itself. Until then, you will deal with me. Most of them dealt with her. The few who initially didn't were redirected by Senna with a brisk efficiency that Mara found deeply satisfying to observe. Eli himself moved through all of this with his characteristic stillness, attending, absorbing, asking his precise and occasionally devastating questions, being unimpressed by things that were designed to impress him, and returning always to his mother's side with the reliability of someone who had learned, in the wilderness and before it, that her presence was the one fixed point around which everything else organized itself. He was learning the old language, not from formal instruction, from Voss, who taught him the way she taught everything, in the layered and associative way of genuine memory, which was the only way the language had ever been intended to be learned. He was quick with it, unnervingly quick. Sometimes he corrected her pronunciation in the gentle, matter-of-fact way of a child who doesn't yet know that correcting elders is supposed to be awkward. Voss found this delightful. The house was finished in early spring. Mara stood in the doorway on the first morning and looked east. The window faced east, of course, because that had never been negotiable, and watched the light come in across a floor. She had laid herself into a room that was larger than the last one, and already beginning to accumulate the particular quality of a lived-in space. The slow personalizing that happens when a home starts to become itself. She heard Eli's breathing change in the next room as he moved from sleep toward waking, the specific rhythm of it, as familiar to her as her own heartbeat, only now it was different. Slower, deeper. The breathing of a child who had slept, for the first time in longer than she could precisely remember, without waking at intervals to check the perimeter. Without that shallow alert vigilance that had lived in him even during sleep for so long, she had begun to accept it as simply part of him. He was sleeping peacefully. She stood in her east-facing doorway in the early spring light and listened to her son sleep, and felt the specific, enormous relief of a thing she had been holding for so long that her arms had forgotten they were holding it, setting it down at last. Not because the world had become safe. The world was not safe and had never been, and she was too honest to pretend otherwise, but because the world finally knew what she had always known. He was not a monster. He had never been a monster, and neither, for a single moment of a single day of her entire life, had she. The fire had taken the house. It had not taken this. It had not taken the amber-eyed woman who rebuilt, in the cold with her bare hands. It had not taken the boy with the ancient mark and the golden eyes and the questions that rearranged the air around them. In Ra, it had not taken the truth, which had simply waited with the patience of things that do not require human permission to exist, for the wall built around it to develop its first crack. The morning light came through the east window and lay across the new floor in a warm, unhurried gold. Mara breathed it in. Outside, Ironvale was waking. The pack was going about the ordinary, unremarkable business of a community in the long, slow work of becoming something better than it had been. Imperfect, interrupted, regularly failing and regularly trying again, which was the only form that genuine change had ever actually taken. The spring was coming, and in the room next door, the heir of the Ashen Crown slept like a child. Because his mother had made sure of it, because she had always made sure of it, because that, more than destiny, more than bloodline, more than the old law singing in the bones of every wolf in the northern territories, was what she was. This is a story about what cannot be burned, not homes, not names, not the truth of who your child is, no matter how many people in positions of power decide it's more convenient to call him something else. At its heart, this has always been Mara's story, a woman who had nothing left except the clarity of knowing her son, and who turned that clarity into a shelter more durable than any timber wall. She didn't need the world to validate what she already understood. She just needed to survive long enough for the world to catch up. Eli's destiny was never the point. The point was what his mother did before anyone knew he had one. That is the story worth telling. That is the story worth remembering. And yeah, if this story moved you, if you've ever protected something precious in the dark, without acknowledgement, without certainty, without anyone watching, subscribe and hit the notification bell, and I will see you in the next story.